I'm not a mic stand kind of person, so we're not going to do that tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aiden O'Keefe. Yeah, that's my women's soccer team right there. I'm one of the leaders of Storming to Change. For those who don't know about our group, we are basically one of the diversity, equity, and inclusion committees here on campus. Our purpose is to serve as kind of the student athlete-led group that kind of has these uncomfortable conversations and pioneers change. So we're here tonight starting our intersectionality speaker series. We've done a lot of projects in the last couple years that have to do with collaborating with Coach K in the weight room to kind of make that more of an inclusive space. Since she is our strength and conditioning coordinator, she sees every single student athlete here. So we felt that that was a really important connection to establish. We also just had our second annual DEI kickoff event with all the student athletes, which is really cool. We don't really see all of our student athletes getting to connect together a lot at other institutions, so we think it's a cool opportunity, and hopefully we can do more of that and expand on it a little bit. So the theme of tonight is about intersectionality. Intersectionality means each of us in this room and watching online have our own unique identity, and each person's identity kind of has, you know, a varying number of factors, some of which you can see more outwardly in some people, some of which we kind of keep just closer to ourselves. So the idea of intersectionality is that, you know, no person is or should be confined to one label or one stereotype or one thing that we would think of them as. So that's kind of our theme of tonight. I think you've heard enough of me, so without further ado, I'm going to pass it along to my friend and colleague, Tori, and she's going to introduce our guest speaker tonight.
All right. With National Coming Out Day being tomorrow, October 11th, I think hearing a part of Kenna's story and finding ways to connect it to our own can be extremely powerful and moving. Kenna Gilmore is a strategist for the Action Center on Race and Economy in New York City, where he mobilizes resources and works with researchers and organizers to achieve economic and social justice for BIPOC and working class communities. He holds a BA from Hamilton College in government and a minor in women and gender studies, and was the sole recipient of the James Soper Merrill Prize, awarded to the member of a graduating class who, in character and influence, has typified the highest ideals of the college. During his senior year, Kenna was named the first ever NCAA LGBTQ Athlete of the Year, coming off an impressive career during which he earned numerous accolades, including NABC First Team All-American, NESCAC Player of the Year, COSETA First Team Academic All-American, and the prestigious Jostens Trophy for his basketball ability, academic achievements, and community service. As a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice speaker advocating for the intersections of Blackness and queerness, Kenna passionately shares his story and hopes to empower others to affect change in their respective communities. So everyone, please welcome Kenna Gilmore.
Thank you, thank you. Move this out of the way. I am really excited that you are all here tonight, and some people are tuning in remotely as well. As you heard, my name is Kenna Gilmore, and I use he and him pronouns. I want to give a shout out to the University of New England and Ed Silva, who's back there, for helping orchestrate this event, and for Storming to Change, the student organization, helping facilitate it. So let's give them a round of applause. So a little bit more background on me. I grew up in New Paltz, New York, which is a small town around an hour and a half north of New York City. I grew up there with my mom and my dad and my brother and sister as well, and I went to Hamilton. I not only graduated with a major in government and a minor in women's and gender studies, but I also played a little bit of basketball while I was there. I want tonight to be something that is informative and maybe even perspective changing, but I also want it to be fun and to be engaging. If anyone comes up with any questions throughout, we're going to have some time at the end built in, so just try to remember it. If you need to take out your phone and write it in your notes, just hold on to it. Got a little clicker. So, today is Indigenous Peoples Day, which is a really important day, obviously for quite a few people. And right now, we are sitting on the Wabanaki and Dakina territories. I want to apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. As a major part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is really important that we are aware of the history of the spaces we occupy. And obviously, this land was unconsensually taken, just like most of the majority of territories in the United States. In addition to today being Indigenous Peoples Day, tomorrow is National Coming Out Day, which holds a near and dear space in my heart. It is a day where people are living their most honest truths and showing their true colors. And for many members of the queer community, this is a catalyst or a jumping off point in being the most honest, uncompromising version of themselves. And this is something I'm going to get into a little bit more. So before I get into my personal story, there is some language and some terminology I'm going to be using that may be unfamiliar to some of you. We all come from different backgrounds and different access to knowledge, so I want to make sure we get some consensus and lay some groundwork out. So feel free to read these definitions, and there's a few I'm going to key in on. I'm not going to read all of them. Don't want to bore y'all. The first is queer. The word queer, for the majority of its history, was used as a slur or as a derogative or pejorative word to members of the LGBTQ plus community. Growing up, some of y'all may have heard this word being used as an insult to someone who is perceived as gay or perceived as a part of the LGBTQ plus community. It has been reclaimed, and it is now an identity marker. So it's an umbrella term. Anyone who is within the LGBTQ plus community can use this word when identifying with either their sexuality or their gender or their presentation, and it is a lot less confining than potentially a word like gay. I myself personally identify with the word queer most often, and it is something that in our language is just getting more and more popularized and normalized, again, not as a slur, but as a term of identity. Another term I want to make sure we all understand is cisgender. So cisgender is a term used to refer to an individual whose gender identity aligns with the sex assigned to them at birth. So when I was born, the doctor looked at me and determined I was male-bodied, and I now identify as a man. And because of that correspondence, I am cisgender. Some other gender identities that are common are people are transgender or agender or gender non-conforming. The last of these terms I want to cover is heteronormativity, which is unfortunately something we see a lot in athletics and specifically in men's athletics. Heteronormativity is the assumption that everyone is heterosexual and that heterosexuality is either superior or the norm or a dominant sexuality. So if one example would be is if there is a women's sports team and everyone assumes that each person on that team is attracted to men or has a boyfriend, that is one example of heteronormativity. Another one that's a little bit more abstract would be if someone comes out of the closet or says that they are bisexual or pansexual and others say that they are going through a phase. That implies that whatever sexuality they now are is something that is experimental or short-term, and that they're going to be coming back to this dominant group, which is heterosexuality. I want to get a temp check. Do these terms make sense to everyone? We good? You got it? All right, great. So James Baldwin is, in my opinion, one of the coolest people on this planet, or was one of the coolest people on this planet. He was a writer and an essayist and an activist and an academic, and he also was a queer black man. And when he was an adult reflecting on his identity, he said that it took many years of vomiting up all the filth I'd been taught about myself and half believed before I was able to walk on the earth as though I had a right to be here. I have a right to be here. You have the right. We all have the right. I did not find this quote until my adult life, and it was jarring. It made me freeze and start to kind of reckon with my childhood and teenage years. Some of the questions that would come to mind are, what parts of me do I feel are celebrated? And what parts of myself do I feel have a right to be here? And on the flip side of that, what parts of myself do I feel do not have a right to be here? What parts of myself do I feel I have to hide or do not feel accepted? And using his words, what filth have I been taught about myself and half believed, and what ideology do I have to vomit up? I hope that this quote can stay as a motif and a central theme throughout my entire story, and something that kind of comes back into your brain as you hear about my personal experience and my story. So, in this picture, I am number 30 right there, my hand on my knee. This picture comes from 7th grade when I was on the modified basketball team. Middle school can be a very strange time for all of us. We are just awkward and young and trying to make sense of the world. But it was particularly memorable for me. I was starting to make sense of the world and start to understand my own personal identity. And while a lot of things were a whirlwind, there were a few things in my life I was confident about. I like to call these my 3 absolute truths, or my simple truths. These were 3 things I knew and were kind of unwavering at that time. The first was that I loved my family. I was starting to understand the sacrifices my mom made in coming to this country from Somalia, which is in East Africa. How hard my father had to work to provide for us. I was starting to appreciate my older brother and younger sister, and I realized that I was no longer going to take my family for granted. The second thing was that I loved basketball. I was obsessed with the game, and I had caught what I like to call the basketball bug. I wanted to work out every single day. I wanted to watch every game on TV. I was either in the gym or an open run or talking about the game, and this was going to be a large part of my future. The last of these 3 things was that I knew that I was gay. I was young and did not have the terminology or the understanding of nuance to fully understand this, but I knew that I was never going to be attracted sexually or romantically to the girls in my classroom, no matter how hard I tried. These were many of my best friends, but it never went beyond that, and I never had an emotion other than just admiration. At the same time, I was beginning to have some strange, sometimes confusing, and sometimes strong emotions toward some of the boys in my classroom. I at first chalked these up as just appreciation or friendship, but deep down, I knew it was a little bit more than that, and that really scared me. We all saw the patterns as kids, how people who were perceived as gay or were queer were treated. They were, honestly, designated as second-class citizens. There was a lot of jokes made about men who were feminine or women who were masculine and trying to act like men. I only have one hand free, but I'm using air quotes when I say that. Just wanted to clarify. But I was really afraid of all these labels and all the negative stereotypes associated with the queer community. As a 7th grader, I just wanted to be cool. I wanted to have friends. I wanted to be accepted and loved by the people close to me. And everything that was associated with the LGBTQ community scared me. And in response to that, I started to distance myself from this part of my identity. I changed the way I moved my body, my mannerisms, my language. Even many of the people that I associated myself were all relegated to appearing straight and putting on this facade of heterosexuality. And as a child, this has a major impact on how you interact with the world and even how you internalize a large part of yourself. As I got older and went into high school, I really started to excel as an athlete. I transferred to a boarding school in Connecticut, and while there, I was surrounded by some of the top talent athletically. I had great coaches and resources. I started to receive a couple Division I scholarships for basketball, and I was really ascending in this aspect of my life. At the same time, I started to struggle more and more with my sexuality. I realized that this part of my identity was not something I could just brush away or throw under the rug or ignore. It was really confusing to externally be celebrated and seen as someone doing really well and achieving my dreams, whereas internally I was deeply struggling and confused and kind of scared and felt isolated. The person that is behind me in this picture, assuming most of y'all know who it is, all good if you don't, but this is Kobe Bryant. Kobe passed away in 2020, so I first just want to say, may he rest in peace. Kobe was, and to this day is, one of my favorite athletes. He is the epitome of hard work and determination. Whenever he played, he radiated this joy and this competitiveness, and he is an inspiration to people across sports, across continents, and really was an ambassador for the game of basketball. Naturally, I tried to watch every game of his I could. He played for the Lakers for the majority, if not all of his career, which was in LA. So his games were on really late at night. So I would finish my homework and rush to the TV and try to watch the game before I went to bed. And one time in 2011, I was around 15 or 14 at the time, he had a game. I turned it on, and it was in the third quarter. This is a part of the regular season. He got called for a foul, and I think it was his fourth foul, so he got sent to the bench angrily, and the cameras were trailing him as he walked back. When Kobe sat down, he started to yell, and he was yelling loud enough that the cameras and the audio picked up on what he was saying, and it was broadcast across national television. Kobe was screaming homophobic slurs and berating the ref with homophobic language. This was my idol, this person I looked up to almost as a deity or a god, sacrificing this entire identity group just to get his point across. As someone who looked up to him and was really struggling with this part of myself, it was painful to have your hero insult this part of you. It can hurt, and it made me think that the sports world was not for people like me. It made me feel like this passion I had in basketball and my identity were mutually exclusive, and that I had to choose either, the game that I wanted to play or the person that I knew I was, and that I could not do both at the same time. As you all can see in this picture, everyone is really excited. This was during my junior year, and during the NCAA tournament. We had just sealed the deal in the round of 32, and we're obviously looking forward to the Sweet 16. When I got to college, I was still in the closet. Many of these fears and internalizations I had experienced during my childhood and high school years still gave me pause and still made me fear things. During my freshman year, I, as a closeted person, still found ways to fit in. I was accepted by my teammates and felt like I was a part of a community. As an athlete, I had done really well and was actually our first Rookie of the Year for the men's basketball team. And academically, I was doing strong too. But despite this base I had created, I still did not want anyone to know who the real me was. We have all seen that on almost every level of sports, there is likely some level of heteronormativity or homophobia. And every time I thought, what would it be like if I were to come out, some thoughts flooded my brain. Just in general, I wondered if my family would accept me. I wondered if my friends would still respect me or treat me the same, or if I would be looked down upon. And as an athlete, I was worried if my teammates would think I was weaker, if I would no longer be seen and respected as a competitor, if the locker room would now be a space that I did not feel comfortable or was treated differently in. And even if my coaches, honestly, would still think that I would take the game as serious. Could I be trusted to guard the best player on the other team? Could I be trusted to take the last shot for us? Could I be trusted to be physical and aggressive? As those are obviously things that are not usually associated with being gay. When I did end up coming out, I was really surprised. Everyone welcomed me and opened me with open arms. My community was receptive of the person I was, and while everyone was not fluent in the terminology and was often really inexperienced, I knew everyone was putting their best foot forward, and that's what meant the world to me. A few weeks after coming out, I had a really honest conversation with a lot of my teammates, and some of them said I was the first gay person that they were ever friends with. Others said that I was the first gay person that they had ever played sports with. And while I obviously don't know everyone from their past, I corrected them and said, I may be the first out person that you have been friends with or you've competed against athletically, but I am certainly not the first person. And this again goes back to this idea of heteronormativity and the assumption that everyone is straight. So I want y'all to bear with me for a second. I'm going to explain these graphs and it will make sense. So this graph on the left is a representation of the openly gay men's professional athletes in the 5 major American men's professional sports. So those are the NBA, which is basketball, the MLB, which is baseball, the MLS, which is soccer, the NHL, which is hockey, and there's one more, the NBA, basketball. I should have known that one. So if you are to accumulate all the current athletes in those 5 sports, it comes up with 5,000 people, right? So out of 5,000 people, if you all can see that thin orange sliver, there are just two openly gay men's athletes. One is a soccer player in the NFL, in the MLS, and there is a football player in the NFL, Carl Nassib, who came out last year. So 2 out of 5,000 is obviously an incredibly small number. If we juxtapose that against societal averages, which as of 2022, Gallup, which is a company that conducts surveys and polling, determined that 7.1% of Americans identify as LGBTQ+. Personally, I think that this number is very challenging to quantify, and if I had any predictions, it'd be likely far higher. But even if we go with 7.1%, if we take a sample size of 5,000 people, that would come up to around 350 people, as you can see on the graph on the right. Now, this is not an exact science, but if we are to compare 350 to 2, that is a stark difference. A few people have asked me in the past why I think there are so few openly gay people in men's sports and in men's professional sports. And this question makes sense. I understand the approach behind it, but I think it is not taking the right angle. If we think about the history of homophobia in these sports, I think the question instead should be, how can we make these spaces more inclusive so that people that are queer feel comfortable living their truest selves? I think if we change our approach to a lot of things in regards to diversity, equity, inclusion, and bring compassion and bring support to marginalized people instead of asking blanketed questions, we're likely to see the amount of orange in the right graph grow from that little sliver to an amount that's much larger. When I first started doing any work in the social change space or in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I focused on identities solely similar to mine. This being people who are people of color, people who are queer, and those who are occupying those identities within the athletic space. I now work at the Action Center on Race and the Economy, and while there, I have really evolved this approach to try to help all marginalized people. So not just people like myself, but all groups of people who are potentially being exploited and marginalized. And in working with a ton of different activists, in working with organizers, my perspective has really changed on how we can affect and make this world a better place. We sometimes get hung up on the fact that we're not celebrities or professional athletes or politicians or academics with decades of experience. But you don't have to be LeBron James or Elizabeth Warren to affect change. It can be all of us as individuals and within our community. So if it is holding your friends accountable to be using more inclusive language, or working with your team to change the way you approach certain situations, or even creating a group within your school to address problems that you see, these smaller and grassroots level approaches can have ginormous effects when we work in collective and in collaboration. If there's anything you all come away with from today, it's that you have a right to be here. And I hope we can make it so everyone has this right and no one is questioning if they deserve to belong. Again, I am just a kid from New Paltz, New York, who knew that he loved his family, who knew that he loved basketball, and who knew that he was gay. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenna.
Yeah, if
We're
you
gonna
give
open
me,
the floor.
let me get one more second.
Go ahead, go ahead.
So I have compiled a list of resources based on a lot of the themes I have touched upon tonight. This is a combination of books and film. Some touch on race, some touch on classism, some touch on gender, some touch on kind of a historical collection of all these themes. And in addition to that, I left my email at the bottom if anyone has questions that pop up sometime after today, or if anyone has something they are not feeling comfortable asking in a group. And feel free to take a picture if you don't feel like writing down any of these resources.
Thank you, Kenna. We're going to open up the floor for the Q&A, and since I have the mic, I'm going first. One question for you. What advice would you give to people who hold a story, however different from yours, to themselves?
Yeah. I think one thing that is really important for all of us to understand is that we are often sharing an experience much more than we think. So me, during my childhood and struggling with queerness, I really thought that I was alone and that there was no one else in a similar position or having similar questions about their identity. But obviously there's millions of people who are going through similar things, and even within other identity groups, there are likely a lot of other people. So finding a community, whether it be in person, whether it be online, and just again remembering that you're not going through something alone, and there are likely a lot of other people going through the same thing, and thinking about resources that may be able to help you are a few ways I think that you can make that a little bit easier for someone.
If you were to go back in time, what was one thing you would change in terms of your personal journey?
Yeah. One thing I would potentially change if I would go back in time. I think at times when I was trying to fit into the straight community, at times I may have even insulted or made fun of, obviously as a child, the idea of queerness or gayness or sexuality as an attempt to fit in. And while I may have been in 7th or 8th or even 9th grade, I would not want anyone else to feel that their identity was less than or exploited. So even though that was just kind of a foolish, childish way at trying to gain acceptance, I now wish that I never had sacrificed a part of my own identity just to gain acceptance from others.
And with the type of world we live in today, what does it mean for you to be able to tell your story and give this experience?
Yeah. While it is 2022, I think events like this are still pretty unique and not something we come across every day. Even from 2020 and to 2016 when I was in college, I had never experienced an event like this. So I think I am privileged to grow up during this time. If we think about how it was like in the 70s and 80s and 60s, there's a chance we'd all be arrested for being here. So thank goodness it's not that time. But just understanding the hard work and effort other people put into allowing us the privilege and the safety to have conversations like this is something I really appreciate.
And did you ever see, I'm sorry, does anyone have a question? Go ahead. Go ahead.
So throughout your presentation, you talked about coming out and how that story was. Do you think that the stigma behind coming out and having to tell your story to other people is ever going to go away? Because a lot of like the straight or heterosexual community, they don't have to do that. And I know a lot of people are very uncomfortable with it and they're not really sure how to do it or what the reactions of the like external part of it is going to be. Do you think that stigma will ever go away or needs to go away?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some members within the queer community say that they shouldn't have to come out or that they don't want to. This is an additional effort and a burden, something that can be very stressful that a lot of people never have to experience and never have to worry about. So I do think that there's a privilege in not having to do that. If we do get to that point, it would likely be quite a ways from now, but it would be great to come to a point where there are no perceptions or assumption of someone's sexuality before getting to know them, and that no one has to prove that they are a member of their queer community or explicitly say it. But we have a long journey before we get to that point, and especially within the athletic world, we have some steps to take first.
Hey, Kenna, thanks for sharing your story. From a coaching perspective, I'm curious, what was the dynamic like when you came out, and how did your coach at Hamilton support you through that process? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually came out to my coach before I came out to any of my teammates. It was over winter break, and I had come back a day or two before everyone else just to get some extra work in the gym, and I felt like it was the right time to tell him. And he was incredibly supportive. I noticed right away that his use of language would change. He would not say things like, "Oh, if anyone wants their girlfriend to come to this event, feel free," but he would say partner, which to a majority of people meant nothing, but to me made me feel like I was seen and accepted. And another thing he did is he really just started to ask me questions individually, like, how are you feeling about this, or should I approach this differently? And by him kind of giving me some agency and acknowledging that I had more experience and awareness in this space than he did, it really strengthened our bond, and athletically and even just as human beings really brought us closer together, and in the long term kind of brought our whole team together. So just changing your approach to giving that person some of the power or agency in the relationship, and changing your language to make them feel seen are some ways that the coaches can really make a player feel like they're included.
Have you ever experienced someone like using homophobic slurs while you were playing? And if so, how did you handle it, or how would you suggest someone would handle it?
Yeah. There was actually a time during my senior year, it was in a conference game, and I had my nails painted. My little sister painted them over winter break, and I was like, I'm not going to take them off. They matched the jersey, so I kept it. it was a really competitive game, and I was at the foul line. And I think because all the motion had stopped, someone was able to see my nails. And he did use a homophobic slur against me, and I was kind of shocked. It took me out of it. A part of me wanted to get upset, but I kind of just let it pass, and I focused on the game. And I think we got the revenge by winning the game, and I ended up scoring 30 points, and he was the person guarding me. So that was my way to get back at him. Some of my teammates after the game asked me, how I felt, and some of them apologized for kind of not stepping in there. So if anyone is on a team and they hear this going on, I think one way you can kind of show your allyship is by stepping up in that instance. And even if you're not called out, just letting your teammate know you're there for you. So I think those are some good ways to handle it. But allowing that to kind of rile you up, or you reacting violently or angrily, almost allows them to win that game, because they're trying to get into your head. And if you allow them to, despite how challenging it is, it kind of lets them win in a way. So that's a great question.
Hi, my name is Selma. So you mentioned that your coach made a change in his vocabulary, but did Hamilton University make their own change as a school to help support LGBTQ plus community a little better, or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I ended up coming out at the tail end of my freshman year into my sophomore year, so I still had 3 years to allow them to make adjustments. One of the first things that happened was our athletic director started to connect with me more, started to make sure that, again, that I was feeling supported, that I was not kind of outcasted in any capacity. This was also at a time where LGBTQ plus inclusion just in college sports was changing. I don't know if UNE is involved in the One Team initiative, but more LGBTQ plus programming was brought to the school, and there was some banners and some flyers held up around the school in general. And a lot of coaches who I think initially were kind of intimidated around not wanting to step on someone's toes or say the wrong thing, started to speak to me and my coach about ways that they could kind of make their spaces inclusive, just proactively even, so that if someone were to come out, that they already had felt like they were supported, and that everyone didn't just need to scramble in the moment, and that there was kind of a system already built into place.
My name's Will. I was just wondering, when you were growing up, did your personal struggle with your own identity affect your athletics? And if so, how'd you get past that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the time it affected me most actually was in high school, when my identity and my understanding of my sexuality was the most in my head was actually in July going into my senior year, which for basketball players is the most important, or at least was the most important time. It's when you're playing in the summer and you're traveling and all these coaches are recruiting you. And I started to, even in games, start to think about this struggle I was having, and it started to become this really large part of just having real estate in my head. Some of the ways I started to deal with it were just, journaling. I was not comfortable at the time with speaking with someone, but I think had I had a therapist at the time, it would have been an incredible way just to express and find an outlet. Or again, even finding some level of community, whether it be in person or online. But yeah, and that kind of goes for struggles athletically at large. We can't just turn off our emotions or our brains when we have a game or have a practice. So if there's anything you're going through, it's likely to kind of follow you into the athletic event. So finding ways to kind of healthily deal with your mental health, kind of allow you to play way better. And if I had been able to go back in that time, I think I would have done even better had I found ways to kind of work through those challenges.
I was wondering if you ever got fed up with being labeled as a queer athlete and just wanted to be seen as just an athlete. And if so, what advice would you have for somebody trying to balance wanting to use their voice and speak up, but not letting that part of their identity consume how people see them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That was actually a huge fear that I had. I thought that once I came out, that was going to be all I was just this queer person that played sports, and that all other aspects of my personality, the academic interests I had, the person I was, all that was just going to be erased, and that I was just going to be this like token and purely objectified. And I think for a little bit after coming out that kind of happened. I think people would see me and like, it's almost like this like firework went off in their brain. They're like, oh, that's the gay guy who plays basketball. But over time, just, you know, being more of my honest and true and unapologetic self shone through, and some of that initial reaction went away. I think it is a reasonable fear to have, but I think it's not something that should hold people back, because again, the people that are close to you are going to see you as the entirety of yourselves. So just being your most honest and genuine self, when people get used to that, a lot of those labels will slowly start to melt away, and you'll just be again seen as a human being and not as those labels.
Coming out takes like a lot of courage and strength. When you did that, did you feel that you needed to prove yourself any more than before? And if you did or did not, what like encouraging words could you tell someone who feels like they do need to prove themselves, whether it is in athletics or just life in general?
For sure. I think when I came out, I knew that, you know, those certain stereotypes would be connected to my athletic ability, that I would not be as tough or as strong, or that maybe in some ways I couldn't compete to the same capacity as straight people. And it did motivate me. It made me want to prove that I was tougher than everyone or a better athlete. And that is not necessarily kind of a healthy way to approach things. I think that someone should, you know, just be able to exist as themselves and not put that additional pressure on themselves, and not really try to cater to the crowd or to like a heterosexual lens. A large part of struggling with identity and struggling with queerness for people is, again, proving that those stereotypes are wrong. And while that can be a good motivation, if you allow that to kind of dictate the path that you're going to go on, you're playing into someone else's game. And again, it's just not healthy. You can be, you know, speaking to people of all identities, you can be your fullest self, and you deserve to belong here, whether you do or don't kind of check off the boxes or expectations of other people.
So Kenna, you shared about the type of support that you got. It sounds like, you know, your coach and your teammates, you know, came around to be really supportive. Were there any, whether it was family or people in the Hamilton community, were there some points of friction? Were there some people who weren't willing to accept you as your true self, as you say? Yeah,
there were definitely some points of friction. There were a few athletes on other teams who I wasn't super close friends with, but if I was in the cafeteria eating, they would come sit down and we would chop it up, or even just say hi around the school. And some of those people started to treat me differently. At first, I wasn't sure, oh, maybe, you know, they're just having a bad day or don't want to see me or something like that. But I started to notice a little bit of a pattern. And it was disheartening. It made me think that, you know, they wanted to sacrifice our friendship or no longer cared about me just because of this part of who I was that I can't even necessarily choose. But there's a quote that goes, if they mind, they don't matter, and if they matter, they don't mind. And I just kind of reminded myself of that. And if someone was worth being a part of my life, that they would be okay and accepting of who I was. And if they were going to allow this smaller part of who I was to sacrifice our friendship, that they were not worth even having around, and that they were not someone I needed to kind of worry about their opinion.
What advice or suggestions would you give for jokes or comments that go a little too far in like a locker room setting?
Yeah, the locker room is a really unique terrain. It's a spot that a lot of things are said that are not often said in other environments. Obviously, comedy and jokes is going to be a part of any team, and it's a part of team bonding, really. I think that when it starts to feel targeted or if there's a joke that is only, kind of sacrificing one person's identity or singling someone out, that's when it goes from being funny to almost being bullying in a sense. That's, again, a really great spot for allies to step up. It can be really challenging if you're a part of that butt of a joke to fight for yourself again. You may feel like you are isolated, but just calling it out or saying, say something else, or why are you saying something that's going after that person, and just finding small ways to call it out, whether it be in that moment or even after the fact, if there's a little bit too much tension.
Hello, my name is Megan. I am the president of another club on our campus. It's called Female Athlete Alliance. And so we have some similar missions to Storming to Change. And while we've been talking about all of this, I've really been thinking about the intersectionality with gender as well, and just kind of how it's actually really interesting because heteronormativity, I guess, is like approached in a very different way in women's sports, just because if you play a sport as a woman, like you said, some people take it as like, oh, you're in that sense like more masculine. Mm-hmm. And so I was just wondering, I consider myself an ally and trying to learn more every day. So what advice would you give to, I guess, female athletes to kind of like help male athletes even more in terms of kind of the stuff you've touched upon, as well as just like mental health stuff as well, because mental health is even more stigmatized for men. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, those are some really good questions. I first would want to say, in terms of like the social justice front, women's sports have been the torchbearers and leading the way really since the beginning of sports. If we look to somewhere like the WNBA, their activism has inspired and really pushed the NBA and men's sports to step forward. In regard to mental health in men's sports, I think that the more we just normalize terms like therapy or terms like queer, and just letting people know that there is not this expectation of them being these, or men being these stoic, unemotional, hyper-masculine beings that can't have any weaknesses or fears, and helping neutralize that expectation and that pressure that a lot of men put on themselves would be a good way to be an ally.
I believe we have a question from the chat.
Mary is asking, she says, thank you for sharing your story, Kenna. Similar to Ed's recent question, did you find that there were folks who took greater interest in you in the wider community at Hamilton after you came out?
Yeah. I'm not sure if that greater interest is in a negative or positive way, so I'm going to take it as a positive. I think that a lot of people who were within the queer community really started to have my back, and there were a lot of people who were fans of sports and of basketball who didn't necessarily feel comfortable coming to games or didn't have anyone they felt like they could support. So me being at that intersection gave them a friend and someone to talk to, and someone they could go to a game of and cheer on, and knew that there was a mutual love and appreciation. I also just think in general, some people were kind of surprised or, again, amused by this person who fit these two identity groups that were usually seen as dichotomous or separate. So it brought interest or attention from a lot of people. But it wasn't always even positive or negative. Sometimes it was neutral. And again, it's just not all stories are often shared or seen, and sadly there's not representation in a lot of spaces. So when someone fills that void, they can kind of be a figurehead in a way, just because there's not too many people who are in that space.
Hi. I have a question about your minor in Women and Gender Studies. Mm-hmm. Do you think that helped you with your identity through college? And kind of a second part of the question is, do you think that if certain colleges had that as a basic requirement for students to take, like here we have certain requirements for courses, I think that like if we just had a basic 101 that everyone was required to take, it could help the LGBTQ plus community, even with just some of the terms like we talked about today?
Yeah, it is very almost prophetic that you asked that. So I took my first Women's and Gender Studies course my first semester in college and was blown away. It felt like all these ideas that I had in my head, and I thought it was just me thinking them, were really validated and a part of a history and a part of academia. So it definitely helped me kind of come to comfortability with my sexuality, and just being in an academic space where people were talking about bisexuality and transness and gender in a way that was positive and constructive. It meant the world for me. I had been in so many spaces like a basketball team where those things were tabooized or never mentioned, or often if they were mentioned, it was in a negative light. So being in somewhere where that was almost the opposite was incredible for me. And to the second part of your question, after taking that course, I told every person who would listen to me to take Women's and Gender Studies 101. I don't know if that is available here, but if it is, all of y'all go take that. And a course on Women's and Gender Studies, or just diversity, equity, and inclusion in general, where a lot of those terms and a lot of things that we often discuss or see in the news but never really get to the bottom of or the root of. If that was a part of our introduction to college, I think that could likely change the culture of a lot of schools. So yeah, I really like that idea, and I hope you run with it.
Any more questions?
I'm going to ask the last question for tonight, but before we close out, I want to thank you all for being here in person and giving us your time and attention, and for all of you joining us virtually. I also would like to thank you for joining us tonight, as well as Kenna for sharing your story with us. Recently, I had a former teammate reach out to me and kind of like thank me for being so like outward and honest with my own identity. So my question to you is, do you have anyone in your personal life that's kind of like maybe a teammate that's maybe reached out to you and kind of just like thanked you for, being like a shining example to them at all?
Yeah, thank you for that. When I came out, I thought, or I was under the impression that there were very few other members of the LGBT community at my school in terms of people being out, and then especially within the athletic community, I thought there was almost no one, but I was incredibly wrong. There were a lot of people that were unsure of or struggling with their identity, or had acknowledged, the extent of themselves, but did not feel comfortable sharing so publicly. And a lot of those people reached out and said, thank you for being honest with yourself and bearing that burden, and that it kind of made them feel comfortable, and in some cases gave them the strength to take that step later on in their life and come out. And it was not a part of my initial motivation, but sometimes during the early months or even the first year of me coming out as a queer person, just knowing that I was helping other people, and that there were people who were, finding solace or comfort in my experience, it really reminded me that, despite all the challenges, what I did was the right move, and that some of those challenging moments were all worth it, not just for me, but for other people. And thank you for being the entirety of yourself for other people as well.
Once again, I want to thank you for coming and enlightening us with your powerful story. I would also like to thank you guys for all being here. Appreciate it, especially everyone online as well. The uni community really helps us. We want to grow our SDC club and then grow our impact on this campus. And in order to do that, we need more members. So we're hoping this Thursday, we're going to do a little debrief of this event at, as you can see, 8 p.m. Thursday, October 13th. It'll be on Zoom. That way you guys don't have to leave your dorms or, your houses. It'll be a lot. See all of you there. And I thank you guys once again for coming out.
Yes. Thank you all.